Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by James Copley and Phil Smith. As always, we've got plenty to be getting through on this Monday morning, and not least, of course, another draw for Sunderland at the weekend, 2-2 against Watford at the Stadium of Light. Phil, a game in which Sunderland started really well, ended quite strongly, but the bit in the middle wasn't all that great.
Yeah, I thought Watford were pretty good from the start. To be honest, I don't think it was like the Plymouth game, for example, where Sunderland were straight out the gate with 85-90% possession. Sunderland, to me, just never looked quite at it for pretty much until the last few minutes, to be honest. And I thought that was by and large because obviously Watford had been forced to take Sissoko off. He was cramping up. They brought another defender on. I think that invited a lot of pressure and let Sunderland get back into the game. I didn't really think Sunderland were at the races at all, to be honest. I mean, even if you think about the goal, it came from a Watford corner that Sunderland that broke down the other end, won a free kick, deflected. Obviously, a really clever set piece routine to take the lead. So I thought there were kind of two aspects to it. I think Watford were quite good, probably better than we anticipated going into the game, given their recent form and all the noise that's been around that club. Kept the ball well, took the sting out of the game when they needed to, went direct when they needed to, made it really hard for Sunderland to press. And whether it was a bit of complacency, whether it was a bit of fatigue, whatever the reason might be, I just don't think we ever saw Sunderland play anywhere near the level of intensity that we used to seeing from them. And they didn't keep the ball well enough. And obviously, that when you're playing against a team who is happy to slow the game down and make it really difficult for you, you need to hold on to the ball. That's the only way you can play pressure. And I thought there was a sloppiness about Sunderland's performance that we're really not used to seeing this season. And I think that's why they were just never really able to build any pressure.
James, I'll bring you in on this. I mean, what do you make of the performance? Because one thing that Regis Libris sort of pointed to in the aftermath of the match was maybe the 1v1s, the lack of physicality, if you like, the way that Sunderland were dominating certain areas of the pitch in that manner.
I think Joe Bellingham was a big miss. Obviously, his game in the middle of the park, although he's got really, really good technical ability and quality, I think the aspect of his performances that have come on the most has actually been his physicality this season. The way he uses his body, the way he can hook around midfielders, the way he retains possession. You think he's lost it, but then suddenly he has it again and he recycles the ball extremely well. So I think that was a little bit of a miss. And I think it just goes to show how important midfields are, doesn't it? And midfield balance, because with Salis Abdul Samed in there, it wasn't quite right. And Watford did sort of dominate that physical battle in the middle of the park and elsewhere on the pitch as well. So a tough one to take. Just a strange game, though, in a sense that Sunderland had those two chances to win it right at the end, which I'm sure we'll come to. But it very much feels like a 2 points dropped, as did the Plymouth Argyle game. You just feel like you have to win those games at home to be fighting for the automatics. That's now 5 points off the top two. Caveat that with there's a lot of football yet to be played, a lot of twists, a lot of turns, a lot of results elsewhere that could potentially go for Sunderland. So all is not lost, but it does feel a little flatter than it did perhaps a couple of weeks ago. But there's still a lot to be positive about this season. That Sunderland are unbeaten at home this season, unbeaten in 2025, apart from the FA Cup game against Stoke. So there are signs there that Sunderland are chugging along nicely, but to be brutally honest, against Plymouth and Watford, you would have liked to have seen 6 points instead of 2. That could be the difference. You don't know, but yeah, big games coming up. Luton's an interesting game, and so's Leeds as well the following Monday, of course.
Yeah, obviously all eyes now on that Leeds United match going to be a huge challenge for Sunderland. Obviously, the nature of the goals that Sunderland conceded, Phil, and the timing of them as well, felt particularly disappointing. Obviously, the first one coming from that penalty after a really brilliant Anthony Patterson save initially, it has to be said, I think. And then obviously to concede immediately after half-time, albeit to something of a wonder strike, it really seemed to take the wind out of Sunderland's sails.
Yeah, I thought the second goal probably summed it up, in that you have to give Imran Loser a lot of credit. It's an amazing strike. Like, it's not just a good strike, is it? Like, I mean, how many times do you see a player score from that distance? It's incredibly rare. So you give him a lot of credit. Obviously, the move starts with Sunderland losing possession, starting the second half really sloppy. So I think that kind of summed up, Watford. I think you have to give a lot of credit, but Sunderland just an uncharacteristic sloppiness, I think. And we talked a little bit about that. That physical advantage Watford had, you know, the best way to sort of prevent getting that weakness exposed, if you like, is to keep the ball. And for me, that was what Sunderland never did anywhere near well enough throughout the game. Obviously, it's a little bit different later on because you've got to take risks, haven't you, when you're chasing a game, when you're trying to make something happen. And probably you do have to take more risks and be a little braver in possession. But I just never really felt like they had any control of the game. I think like Watford, I think, you know, they have got some really good individuals. I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Obviously, it's not a club that seems to be heading in the right direction, but there's still that kind of smattering of quality there, if you like. I thought Chakvetadze was really, really impressive, the way he dribbled forward, like so much strength. I thought he looked like a bit of a modern Sunderland player, if you like. Like we've seen a lot of Sunderland players in recent years who really, really effective at dribbling, really hard to get the ball off. Thought that gave them an outlet, and I thought Doumbia, the centre forward, when you consider he's 18, that was his first championship start. I think like credit where it's due, he was a real handful, wasn't he? I thought he gave 09 and Mepham a really difficult afternoon. I thought he held the ball up well. He caused problems. So I think from a Sunderland perspective, I think the frustration is that for the second, I thought this was a bit different to the Plymouth game, and that Plymouth really the first half were just sort of defending and kick and rush basically. Second half they were better, to be fair, but I thought Watford had a lot more about them in this game. But I think the common denominator is that Sunderland have just been nowhere near the sort of intensity that we saw from them early in the season at home. And I think that's the really interesting question moving forward. Is that something Lebris needs to change? Is it the fact that teams are now a lot wiser to what Sunderland can do at home, so they're playing differently? Like if you think back to the Sheffield Wednesday game where Sunderland basically just kept catching Sheffield Wednesday playing out from the back, like the press was so good. Our teams now changing their approach, like we've seen it from Plymouth and Watford. They don't invite the press. If they're getting any trouble, they just launch it basically. So I think that's the really interesting thing is it just a little bit of a dip at home because of fatigue, because of some freshness, or is it something where we're seeing teams be a bit more pragmatic when they come to the stadium alive, and that then will put the onus on someone to come up with something a little bit different. I think that's like the interesting question for me. I can't quite work out whether we've just seen Sunderland, well, they have dipped below their best, we know that, but is it also something a little bit of a challenge that they're going to have to adapt to in the next few weeks, because the automatic promotion race isn't over. Like I still think there'll be twists and turns. Like I think Sheffield United and Burnley especially will drop points at some stage. But if Sunderland don't keep drawing their home games, they're going to be too far out for that to matter. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Like Wednesday night is going to be the first test of that, and then moving forward, seeing whether Lebris has to freshen things up a little bit or change the kind of approach from the start of the season.
I mean, Phil's talking about intensity there, James. We were talking a little bit before we came on air about Salis Abdul-Samed. Obviously, a player who came in with a huge amount of hype, a player who's played Champions League level football before, but on Saturday at least, certainly a player who looks as if he hasn't played a lot of football over the past few months.
I think so, yeah, and I think that is the big caveat when it comes to Salis Abdul-Samed, is that he's been out for such a long time. You know, when he started the Stoke game in the FA Cup, he didn't look. He didn't start it. He came on in the FA Cup. He didn't look, sort of quite right, really. That was a much changed side. Although when he came on against Middlesbrough, he's one of the contributing factors towards Sunderland actually winning that game. He's started against Watford, and as I mentioned at the top of the show, the balance of that midfield just didn't seem quite right to me, and that can be down to a myriad of factors that haven't played together too much. Dan Neil is going from a 6 to an 8 position. So there's a lot of play. I wouldn't bet against him coming good at some point in the season, but he does just genuinely look like a footballer who hasn't played a lot of football. As you mentioned, Jace, the intensity, the urgency. I think there was a couple of grumbles from the stand because he just wasn't getting the ball forward quick enough, maybe having just 1 or 2 extra touches, but he's probably unsure really in a sense of where his teammates are going to be and what runs they're going to make, because he just simply hasn't played with them enough, and he hasn't really trained with them enough either. If you consider he's only really been back for 3 or 4 weeks, back with his teammates. He's obviously had a lot of time to study, but in terms of time on the grass, he hasn't had a lot. I think it's interesting that when Mundell and Tommy Watson do eventually come back, will Lafay come into the middle? Chris Rigg to me looks like he could use a little bit of a rest. I think we've been rightfully on the Chris Rigg hype train for a long time, but you do have to call a spade as well, and say that he was pretty poor against Watford. I would back him to absolutely bounce back from that, but by his lofty standards that he set, I thought he was slightly under par. So yeah, that midfield is a real interesting question for me going forward. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about 4-3-3 versus 4-4-2. I think for me, it would have been just hard to justify starting 4-4-2 against Watford. Yes, it might have pushed them back. It might have given Sunderland a little bit more cutting edge and a little bit more up front. But in a game where Sunderland struggled for control and struggled for physicality, to not have another midfielder in there could have been potentially catastrophic, I think. So I don't envy Regis Lebris, because there's a lot to think about heading into the Luton game. And we know that although they are lowly in the table at the moment, Luton Town are a very, very physical team as well. So it's interesting to say the least.
Yeah, it's interesting that James mentions obviously Lefebvre moving in that central role, which obviously the position that I think most Sunderland fans would expect him to play once everybody is sort of fit and firing for Lebris' side, Phil. But we saw him sort of venture in for the first time on Saturday. Lebris sort of bringing Milan Alexic on, but opting to put him out on the left. I mean, how much of a difference do you think it will make to Sunderland when they are able to bring Lefebvre inside and when they are able to call on a Romain Mundle or a Tommy Watson, who are both obviously coming back towards full fitness?
I think the bigger impact, to be honest, will be felt from having a proper winger out on the left. I thought, to be fair, again, Alexic has really got something, hasn't he? I know, obviously, it's the second time he's missed a big one-on-one. Obviously, the Millwall game where Millwall went up and scored, and that kind of becomes the main thing you take away from it. But he's so quick. It's not something I really realised until we started seeing him play. I think he's got something. But you could see in that moment where he goes through on goal, obviously the burst of pace is really impressive, but it's not his position. And I think that having Mundle and Watson back, I think will make an absolutely huge difference to this team. And obviously one of the knock-on effects of that would be that Lefebvre can come into the middle. I thought Lefebvre, really like pretty much everyone in the second half, I thought he was trying a little bit too much. I think sometimes you're almost just screaming for somebody to get the foot on the ball for a minute and just kind of get up the pitch and build a bit of pressure that way. But we saw in the Middlesbrough game just how good he is and that he's going to create chances at pretty much at will, really. So I think it's a very exciting thought to have him come into the middle. And I think that, the bigger thing will be having Mundle and Watson back, because I think we all know how Sunderland want to set up, and so much of it is about getting the ball out wide to the wingers early, where they can either go on the outside or the inside. And I think at the moment you're seeing that Sunderland aren't quite where they were at the start of the season in those positions. And I think on the Samed thing, I think you could see that Sunderland try to learn their lessons from the Watford game a bit. I thought it seemed to me fairly clear that Rigg had been pushed much, much higher, almost as a number 10. So it almost felt like they were trying to play a bit more of a 4-2-3-1 rather than having someone just like Samed was against Plymouth, just stood in front of the back four. But it didn't quite work. And as James said, obviously you see with Samed the impact of maybe not having played enough football. Maybe it's a combination of, as some players haven't played enough football, maybe some players have played a little bit too much at the moment. For me, I think Rigg isn't quite at the level he was earlier in the season. I think that's natural. We have seen that so many times with young players in their first full season. I don't think it's a controversial thing to say. Roberts as well, I think, isn't quite as sharp as he was in the opening 2 months of the season, in my opinion. So, yeah, I think there's a few bits and bobs for Lebris to ponder really moving forward. I think I think Mundle and Watson coming back is going to make an absolutely huge difference. I think just to the balance of the side.
Phil's talking about options out wide there, James. Obviously, we saw Ian Poveda come on for Paddy Roberts. Just interested to get your thoughts on his appearance, because it felt like he sort of divided people. Some people saying he looked very busy, looked very positive. Other people perhaps suggesting that he could have been a little bit more decisive in his decision-making in the final third.
He certainly saw a lot of the ball, didn't he? I was a little bit underwhelmed, to be honest. I thought there was some promising and good touches there, but without really creating anything. He didn't look to get down the line. I didn't think he looked to cut in quite often, and I think Sunderland were 2-1 down at the time, and he was, partial to the odd step over, which I'm never really that bothered about, especially when it doesn't come off. I think having him to challenge Roberts is a really positive aspect, but it's again tricky for him because he's been out for so long. He's played such little football. He was out for so long, then he came back and had a reoccurrence of an injury. So he's been in, out. It's been very difficult to get momentum. And Lebris always talks about momentum and being connected with Sunderland's game plan. And it didn't feel like Poveda was quite there yet. But I think it's hugely positive that he's on the pitch and contributing for Sunderland. I just didn't think that he was overly impressive against Watford. I think he could well be at some point. I've watched him for the under-21s, and he's clearly got some quality. He scored in that European game at the Stadium of Light against Benfica. Really impressive goal. There's definitely something there, but it's just about channeling it, getting them in the right structure. It's always hard for players to come on and affect games, I find, especially when they don't have like 5, 10, 15 starts in a row under the belt. It's been so stop-start for him that I'm sort of loath to criticise him too heavily, but I didn't think he was sort of in tune with what the game really needed when he came on. But I mean, I'd be a hypocrite because it's probably a substitution I would have made actually during the game. So I won't sort of criticise Lebris for it, because I did think Roberts was perhaps tired. He's played a lot of football, obviously, and I didn't think it was his most effective game. So it's a substitution I would have made. It didn't sort of pay off, but yeah, I am keen to see if he can get a run of games or any sort of momentum going towards the back end of the season. What, there's 15, 14 games left, whatever it is. But absolutely good to have him as an option, I think.
And then, obviously, Phil, the other option is Eliza Mayenda. Came on for Chris Rigg on Saturday. Obviously, not in a wide berth, but certainly in a sort of influential attacking role. I mean, is it any real coincidence Sunderland started to look a little bit more dangerous on the front foot when he was on the pitch?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things. I think it was definitely Mienda's presence. I think both him and Isidore are better when the other one's on the pitch with them. I think we've got enough evidence for that to be like, this is something that we can say is definitely the case. I think it was, obviously, I mentioned at the very top there, I thought it was a combination of things. I thought Watford, and we discovered after it was because of injuries and cramp, had to change their shape and stuff, and I thought that really, really disrupted them. So I thought it was a combination of things. I think the Mienda one's really, really difficult, because I think it's easy to say that, if Sunderland had started 4-4-2 on Saturday, they might have won. If they'd started 4-4-2 against Plymouth, they might have won. And I think that's absolutely true, by the way. I think maybe that extra sort of striker, that front foot approach might have won the game. You could also say that actually Sunderland were potentially got away with one against Portsmouth when they played 4-4-2 and scored early because of those two strikers, but then didn't play anywhere near as well as we've seen them afterwards. I thought at Derby, I thought they nearly dropped points in that game again. Like, I think you could say if they didn't have anywhere near the level of control you would have liked over that game, and it nearly cost them in the second half. So I don't see switching to 4-4-2 as like an automatic cure for all of Sunderland's problems. I think it gives them something extra in Mienda, but I think it also takes something away. So I think that's a really tricky one. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I do kind of lean towards, for me, like I'd be trying to get Mienda into the team on Wednesday night, personally, whether that's off the right or whether it's by going with two up top, because I just think at the moment, we mentioned there before, I think it's just now, it looks to me like there's a few players, especially on that right-hand side, who look like they've maybe played a little bit of football, who might benefit from just being an impact sub for a game or two. I think it's really hard to ignore a player who's in really good form, who looks really, really fresh, really, really sharp. I just think, especially for a midweek game, he could bring a bit of a burst of energy, really. I suspect that Lebris probably doesn't want to start Poveda yet, because obviously, as James has just alluded to there, he's had two fairly brief cameos and he's been out for months and months. So I wonder if maybe whether it's going to 4-4-2 or whether it's bringing Mienda in off the right, I think that might be the way to go on Wednesday, just because I think it's, as I say, I think it's hard to ignore at the moment when you look like you're a little bit fatigued in some areas of the pitch. I think it's hard to ignore someone who is so obviously so sharp, full of confidence, and he does make things happen. Like, again, that chance he lays on for Isidore, like he just has that knack. I think he's much better when he plays with Isidore. It's a really tricky conundrum for the Brace that I kind of don't envy him having to try and work that one out. But for me, I think you have to try and get Mienda in the team.
It's a really interesting point, that as well, because in terms of goals and assists per minute, Mienda is top. I think he's got 9 goal contributions in 15 starts, which would make him Sunderland's most effective attacking player. Obviously, Wilson Isidore's got 11, 10 goals, 1 assist, but he's played a lot more football than Mienda. So it's one of those, isn't it? Phil mentions you do lose something in the middle, I think, when you play Mienda, but you also gain something. And he does, as well as gaining Mienda, you do seem to unlock Isidore a little bit more as well, which is also a consideration. I think, although Isidore's a good player, obviously, and can play up front by himself, I do think him and Mienda up front together is potentially electric at times, but you do sacrifice in the middle, so it is a conundrum.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned options in the middle there as well. He wasn't in the squad on Saturday, Phil, but Alan Brown's to come back as well. I mean, do we know how bad Job's injury is? Is he expected to be back in midweek? Are there signs that Sunderland will have more reinforcements in the centre of the pot and more options to choose from against Luton?
Yeah, certainly as of Saturday, Sunderland were expecting Joe to be back on Wednesday night. I think the sort of implication seemed to be that they could probably have taken a risk on him for that game, but they just didn't want to potentially aggravate it or make it anything worse. So it made sense just to give him a breather and not take any risks. So I would expect him to come back into the side on Wednesday straight away, which I think will be a big boost. Brown, I think, obviously he was back in full training last week. He hasn't played for a while, so that's obviously a big factor. I don't think he's going to be like a contender to start game straight away, but he should be back in the squad pretty much, if not Wednesday, certainly the Leeds game. So I think that's good. I think again that bit of extra now, another option for Lebris later in games. He should be fresh, obviously, after having so long on the sidelines. So I definitely think I think at the moment you can see Lebrison's decision making, as we talked about Paveda coming on Saturday. He is trying to get to a point where at the real crunch end of the season, he has a full squad of players pretty much at peak fitness. To me, it's very, very, very similar to what Alex Neil was trying to do the season Sunderland went up from League One, where he was trying to get a breather for players who'd played way too much football in the first sort of 2/3 of the season, while getting players who hadn't played anywhere near enough, Clark, Roberts, up to speed. Now, obviously, for Neil, it came together perfectly. And if you think back to sort of the playoff run, he had the squad pretty much in peak condition. That's clearly what Lebris is trying to get to. He's trying to get having a squad not of 13, 14 players, trying to get 17, 18 players in the right sort of place for the crunch phase of the season. The challenge is that unlike Alex Neil, where we knew weeks out, months out, really, that the top two was gone, that's obviously not the case for Sunderland, is it? They're still right in that race. So Lebris is trying to get that balance between expanding the pool of players and getting everybody in the right place when it really counts, while trying to make sure that Sunderland obviously stay in that race. And I think the Samad one's kind of a great example, and Paveda as well, in terms of trying to get that balance. It is tricky, but you can see what the end game is. He's trying to get these players ready to be decisive in the final weeks of the season, or potentially if it does come to a playoff campaign.
I mean, just on that as well, James, because we haven't spoken since the Jayden Dan's injury came to light. Obviously, something was discovered in his medical. He's gone back to Liverpool for a period of rehabilitation, but the hope there being that he will be another one of those players who has the potential to come in over the last however many games it might be, and potentially a playoff run, and really make an impact for Lebris' side. Another good attacking option for him to call upon.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously it's a little bit disappointing that he has signed injured, but it seems like a bit of a freak incident, really, doesn't it? Sunderland weren't aware, the player weren't aware, and Liverpool weren't aware. So you face the challenge: do we sign this lad in the hope that he'll be fit in 2 or 3 weeks' time? Time was running out in the window, so I do think you had to get the signing done. He is exciting again. I'd probably urge caution, as I said the last time we spoke about them. Is he going to have enough time to get up to speed, develop himself as an option? He is so young. Can he contribute in the Championship immediately in such a short space of time? I have my reservations about that. I was actually interested. I was listening to the Wise Men Say podcast, and they had somebody from the Liverpool end. I think it was the Anfield Wrap on, and they said he just always pops up with big goals in big games, and my mind automatically went towards a playoff campaign, or a crucial goal in an automatic promotion push. So I think it's good to have that sort of talent and mentality around the squad, and hopefully he's fit sort of sooner rather than later, so Sunderland can develop that attacking threat. But I do agree with what Phil said in terms of Lebris trying to develop his squad in terms of full fitness, and it's good to see players like Milan Alexic getting some minutes now. I know he missed that chance, but he does look like he has something, and there are options starting to develop across the forward line and in midfield as well, which I think bodes well for the running, hopefully.
Very much so. Very much so. Let's move away from the men's team for a moment, Phil. Obviously, disappointment for Regis Lebris' side at the weekend, but a really good result for Mel Rhea's women's team. They're through to the quarterfinals of the FA Cup now, the only non-WSL team left in that competition. I mean, it's a wonderful achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a massive achievement. It has massive implications for the club, to be honest. I think in prize money, they've already banked, I think it's about 165 grand. There's a further 22.5 grand guaranteed just for taking part in the quarterfinal. Obviously, the quarterfinal, if you can get a good home draw, there's also the potential maybe of some TV coverage. So we're potentially looking at a cup run that could bank the club, in the region of £200,000, and that could be like really significant going into the summer and moving forward. In terms of the club's the club's planning, it's massive. I think the cup run itself's been a bit of an odd one because the fixtures have been relatively kind in that they've played two teams in divisions below them and the team who was struggling in Portsmouth towards the bottom of the Championship. At the same time, they've all been away, and Exeter and Portsmouth are about the two biggest journeys you could have. So it's been a really tricky run and a fairly kind run at the same time. Listen, I think it's a massive achievement to be the only non-WSL club in the competition, as you mentioned. I think everyone will be fairly realistic going into that quarter-final draw. Obviously, the draw takes place tomorrow tea time. It's going to be really, really difficult. We've seen for the last 3-4 years that the gap between the Super League and the Championship is absolutely massive. So it's going to be a big test, but they did play Man United a couple of years ago in the FA Cup and gave them a really good game, lost fairly narrowly. So I think it's really, as I say, financially really significant. I think it's a big reward for the players, really, who for 2 seasons now have been super consistent. Apart from the start of this season, quite slowly lost the first 2 league games. The reality of a 21-game season is that unfortunately that can really cost you. But they've been super consistent for a long period of time, and I think credit the players, but also to Mel Ray, because she does lead the recruitment on the women's side of things, and the combination she's had over the last couple of years of really brilliant recruitment, but also sort of coupling that with academy players has been fantastic. So hopefully. Everything crossed for a home draw against a big WSL side, because I think it will be the perfect opportunity to kind of showcase what's been built over the last 18 months, 2 years, because it's a good team, but it also plays good football. I think anyone who watches the women's team will tell you that the development in the sides tactically since they pretty much went full time at the start of last season has been massive. So hopefully they can get a home draw and they can really sort of show people who might not yet have seen too much of them what they're all about.
I genuinely think Mel Ray is probably one of the best kept secrets in women's football. I think she's absolutely phenomenal. The work she's done over trying circumstances at Sunderland at times over the past 5, 6, 7 years, however long it's been, I think has been marvellous. Phil mentioned the recruitment, but also bringing academy players through whilst playing good football has been really, really impressive. I always worry about Sunderland women over a summer because they always seem to lose a couple of players, and you always fear that this could be the season where they really, really struggle, and Mel Ray always comes up with the goods. I think the sort of holistic influence she has over the women's side of things it can't be understated. I think she's a vital cog in that football club. I think she doesn't get enough credit.
Absolutely. James, just wanted to sort of bring you in on the under-21s as well. I know you watched Graham Murty's side on Friday afternoon, and they got a hell of a result against Wolves. Obviously, second time they played them in literally a matter of days, but a much improved performance, or at least a very much improved scoreline when they played them the second time at the Academy of Light.
Yeah, it was a good game. Sunderland dominated, won 5-0 with 5 different goal scorers. I think the headlines from the game would be that Jensen Seelt played his first 90 minutes since his cruciate ligament injury. He looked really good, really strong, really powerful. Ahmed Abdullahi, he got his first goal in red and white. He played 45 minutes. He was then replaced by Finn Garaguzian, who is in tremendous form. He's 17 years old, playing for the under-21s. I think it was 4 goals in 3 games. So he played against Wolves twice, and then he played against Leeds and managed 4 goals across those games and an assist, I think, as well. So he feels like the next cab off the rank. He's 6'4", massively talented, can run for days, and he just seems to have emerged out of nowhere. I watched him in the FA Youth Cup last season and thought he looked okay, but his physicality's come on another level, and yeah, that production line seems to keep on keeping on. It's wildly impressive. But under-20 runs are always a great watch. I find I was gutted to see that they'd missed out on the next round of the Premier League International Cup. They were waiting on a result between Blackburn Rovers and Athletic Bilbao. Athletic Bilbao, I think, got a 92nd minute winner, which meant that Sunderland missed out, which was unfortunate. But Sunderland are hoping to qualify for that competition again and get into the playoffs, which they're currently on track to do. The listeners might remember that they got to the playoff final last season. So the Premier League 2 works where you have a regular league season and then everybody goes into a playoff to see who the overall winner is. It's just on a wider point. It's been quite nice to watch the under-21s over the years. We all remember that period under Donald and Methven where they couldn't win a game. The academy was extremely depleted. There were players leaving left, right, and centre. But now it's vibrant. It's full of stories. They win more games than they lose. And the players that are developing from that academy are hugely impressive. And we've seen the likes of Tommy Watson, Chris Rigg, Anthony Patterson, Dan Neil, and others come through. Ben Middlemass was on the bench against Watford again, which was nice to see. So, yeah, very, very vibrant and very exciting up at the academy. I'd encourage any Sunderland fans who have an afternoon spare and there's a game up at Hetton to go and have a look because it's good.
It certainly is. It certainly is. I think the next in action on Tuesday night, Huddersfield Town. Is that right, James?
That's right. Yeah, Premier League 2 Cup.
Lovely stuff. Lovely stuff. Well, I think we'll both be there, and I would highly encourage James at a loose end to get themselves along as well. That's all we've got time for in this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, follow all the latest Black Cats news on the Sunderland Echo. You can give us a follow on social media as well. Thanks to James. Thanks to Phil. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll catch you next week.